For decades, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations was defined by its neutrality and a rigid adherence to non-interference, earning the reputation of a talking shop that was strategically toothless. This institutional paralysis has been systematically exploited by external powers, particularly in the South China Sea, where fragmented maritime policies allowed for the gradual erosion of regional sovereignty. However, the announcement of the first-ever joint military exercise in September 2026, the ASEAN Shield, signals a fundamental shift. 10 nations, led by the tactical initiative of Indonesia, are attempting to move beyond symbolic diplomacy toward a unified operational framework, marking the end of passive non-alignment and the beginning of collective maritime security. The selection of the North Natuna Sea as the primary theater for these drills is a calculated geopolitical signal directed at the 9-line infrastructure. While officially categorized as a non-combat humanitarian and disaster relief exercise, the deployment of naval assets from all 10 member states into waters contested by Beijing represents a significant escalation in regional signaling. By conducting these maneuvers without the direct participation of the United States or China, ASEAN is attempting to create a middle power buffer. The audit suggests that this is not merely a training exercise, but a stress test for a unified regional response to gray zone tactics and illegal, unreported, and unregulated IUU fishing protected by paramilitary coast guards.
From a technical standpoint, the ASEAN Shield faces a staggering challenge in terms of hardware interoperability and communication protocols. The participating fleets represent a chaotic mosaic of global defense procurement. Russian Sukhois, American F-16s, French Rafales, South Korean frigates, and Chinese-built offshore patrol vessels. Establishing a common operating picture, COP, among nations that utilize different encrypted data links and radar systems is a logistical hurdle that has historically prevented real-time tactical cooperation. This exercise will serve as the first raw data set to determine if ASEAN can synthesize these disparate platforms into a coherent defensive grid, or if the Shield will remain a collection of isolated assets incapable of synchronized action. As the United States intensifies its forward defense doctrine, deploying Nemesis anti-ship missiles to the Batanes Islands just 200 kilometers from Taiwan, ASEAN finds itself caught in a tightening kinetic vice. The ASEAN Shield is a desperate attempt to reclaim the regional narrative before the first island chain becomes a permanent front line. However, the Strategic Audit identifies a critical flaw. Several member states remain economically tethered to the very power they are militarily signaling against. This creates a neutrality trap, where the effectiveness of the joint drills is constantly undermined by bilateral backroom deals, making the ASEAN Shield a fragile construct that could fracture under the first sign of real kinetic pressure.
Central to the viability of this regional shield is Indonesia's pivot from the minimum essential force to the more robust Optimum Essential Force framework. This doctrine shift acknowledges that a mere deterrent presence is no longer sufficient in the face of 2026's maritime volatility. Jakarta's acquisition strategy, balancing the KF-21 Borome, the Turkish Khan, and diversified naval platforms, is designed to provide the high-end capability required for this optimum state. However, the audit notes that the transition to OEF introduces immense logistical friction. If Indonesia cannot stabilize the industrial spine required for OEF, the ASEAN Shield will lack the sustainable power needed to anchor a collective regional defense.
The final audit suggests that the ASEAN Shield represents a pivot toward a more proactive form of regional autonomy. By emphasizing maritime safety and disaster coordination, the bloc is attempting to strengthen its internal bonds without aligning with any specific global power bloc. The success of this September 2026 initiative will be measured by its ability to maintain ASEAN centrality, ensuring that the region remains a neutral zone of cooperation rather than a theater for external rivalry. The goal is a resilient framework where regional stability is managed by regional hands, proving that even in a polarized era, a unified diplomatic and maritime presence can still function as a stabilizing force in the Indo-Pacific.